further ado, Dr. Arlene Taylor.
One of the good things about study is that it age-proofs your brain. Research in 3 different countries. For every year beyond basic college that you have education or the equivalent, you reduce your risk of Alzheimer's by 20%. So as we go on that journey, one of the main motivators, if you will, is to reduce our risk for Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. I, for one, am aiming to live to be 122 years old, 165 days. And when I say that, people laugh. If you aim higher, you're going to get farther.
Amen.
And I base that on the fact that not too long ago, Jean-Louise Calment, a French woman who grew up in the south of France, in the little town called Arles, when she died, she was 164 days. I want to outlive her. And she had all her marbles. She took up fencing when she was 87.
Oh, wow.
She rode her 2-wheel bike until she was 100. Come on. She can do it. We can do it. All right, this is part 2. In part 1, I gave you a basic overview of the dehydration statistics and some of the problems that lack of water in the brain and body can cause. And Greg asked me if this time I would concentrate on just dehydration in the brain. It's a little hard to do that because the brain orchestrates everything. On the other hand, everything starts in the brain. So I've gathered a little collection of the brain and dehydration, and that's our topic for tonight. Just a little review. When you look at a globe of this planet, even without adding specific things up, if you will, it's pretty obvious from a globe that there's way more water than there is land. Way more water than solid matter. And on the planet, the estimates are it's about 3/4 water and about 1/4 solid matter. The interesting thing is that the body seems to follow that pattern as well. The body is about 3/4 fluid and about 1/4 solid materials. When you talk about dehydration, you are talking about an alteration of this ratio in favor of solid matter. Not good. We see that on our planet all the time. So we're in a desert and there's a lot of dehydration, so tell me how plant life flourishes. It doesn't. There are some plants that can do it, but it doesn't flourish. So naturally, I mean, we see that in the world, and we know how powerful water is. You know, just look at the last few, what is it, Irma and Marie and I don't know who all else. And it's the damage done by the water. But water is also life-giving, completely life-giving. So dehydration is going to affect everything, naturally, but especially brain function. And in a nutshell, it slows it down if it doesn't stop it altogether. These are some of the percentages showing the water content of different parts of the brain. Is there a laser on this?
Center button.
The center button. Oh, I love brains that have the answers. Thank you very much. So when you look, just going quickly down or up the list, either way, your muscles are about 3/4 water, which follows that 3/4, 1/4. Your liver, it's got more water than solid matter. The heart, again, or the kidneys, certainly, more water. The heart, more water. Skip these two for the moment. Bones have less, no surprise. Blood has more. Then you come to the brain itself, that's 75%, that's pretty much the 75-25. But then you come to the brain cells themselves, and they're way up there with the liver and the blood. So the ratio is really important for health. The estimates in the United States are not pretty. Estimates are that the average person over the age of 55, and I'm not going to ask who's over the age of 55, the average person over the age of 55 in the United States is dehydrated. That's very frightening as we begin to see what dehydration does for the brain. Here's the research. The average person over 55 is dehydrated and drinks less than 1 quart of water a day, 32 ounces. According to the Mayo Clinic, we lose more than 80 ounces every single day through sweating, breathing, and eliminating waste products. So no wonder that over the age of 55, we're seeing dehydration, because if you need more than 80 a day and you're getting less than 32 ounces, it is not going to take long before you're quite dehydrated. One of the problems is that as the brain ages, as the body ages, your sensitivity to thirst takes a nosedive. So if you are drinking to thirst, you're already dehydrated. Because the older the brain and body get, the less aware it is of thirst. So you cannot drink to thirst. You must drink to the recommendations for amount. Some people say, well, I eat some soup and I drink some caffeine and I have wine with dinner. And those are all fluids. They're fluids, but they don't anywhere near add up to more than the 80 ounces. And those particular fluids trigger digestion. Water does not trigger digestion. It's just absorbed and does its work. In a nutshell, the problem with dehydration is this: it shrinks brain tissue. As the tissue shrinks due to reduction of fluid inside the cell, brain function starts to fall off. Dehydration is the most common cause of headaches. Anybody have headaches? It's amazing when you start giving your brain and body the amount of water that's recommended, your headaches disappear. It's linked with irritability. Been irritable lately? Because I'm sure that's not pleasant for anybody around you, or for yourself for that matter. So headaches, irritability, and inflammation. When there's not enough fluid, parts of the brain become inflamed, if you will. And inflammation may possibly underlie almost all chronic illnesses. There's a big move to study that. And inflammation is recently been connected with both depression and mood disorders. So we're seeing all these links with dehydration. When I went through nursing school in the late 1800s, and when I worked on my doctoral programs, nobody ever mentioned dehydration. Do you remember what the rule was, how much water you needed to drink? What was the basic rule? 8 glasses a day. It didn't even say how big the glasses needed to be. Just 8 glasses a day. So if you drank 8 glasses of 8 ounces each, that's 64 ounces. And how much do we lose every single day? 80. So that still wouldn't be enough. And the average person over 65 drinks how much a day?
32.
That's only 4 glasses. And 8 isn't even enough. And if it's really hot, it's way not nearly enough. So can you see how that's becoming a really huge problem in the United States? Because we're talking about the brain, I wanted to show you the 3 functional layers of the brain. There's the first layer, which is called the reptilian layer. This is where the stress responses are located and the brain's alarm system and so on. No conscious thought there. But it is the last part of the brain to die. So when you hear that somebody is brain dead in the hospital, this is probably the only piece that's still working. And it may be keeping the heart beating and maybe keeping the respiration going, but there's no cognition going on, no cognitive thought. The center layer is called the mammalian. It's called the mammalian because mammals have it. Good. Are we mammals?
Yes.
We are mammals. In the mammalian layer are phobias, emotional impulses, again, a subconscious part of the brain. Then you get up to this top layer, the neocortex, or that third brain layer. We do have some conscious thought up there, but we're not talking about the whole thing. We're talking about 15 to 20% of that, most of which is probably going to be right here behind your forehead. So when you hear people talking about cognition, cognitive thinking, it simply means that what's going on up there you are aware of. And you can only manage what you can identify, label, and describe. And you have to be able to do that consciously in order to work with it. Dehydration is going to impact all of these brain layers in different ways. If your brain cells start to shrink, lose water inside the cell, that is going to impact conscious thought. It's going to get foggy. If it impacts the mammalian layer, and that gets dehydrated, and now you start getting some inflammation, your emotional impulses may be more erratic. And you may have trouble managing them when ordinarily you wouldn't. And the stress reactions down here in the first brain layer, fight, flight. And by the way, there's new research that shows when there is a stressor or you feel unsafe, every brain may initially go into fight, flight, but women, the female brain, stays there very little. Fight, flight is primarily a male brain response. Females tend to go into something called tend, befriend, meaning that they say, you know, I must have messed up somewhere. You know, let me go back and try it again and work a little harder, and maybe I'll get it right this time. And sometimes that's a good idea, and sometimes it is not a good idea. And then there is, of course, the conserve, withdraw stress response. Somebody dies unexpectedly in your family. You go into almost like shock. And it's like the brain says, okay, we're just going to hibernate right here for a while. And people's behaviors change. You know, their things that they love to do change. They may not eat well, may not exercise well, problems sleeping. The brain is just saying, sit tight. You know, we can't fix it. Just sit tight, and eventually you can get back to life. Anybody can go into conserve, withdraw. The question is, are you going to get stuck there? Because you can get stuck and then not go on with living. So one of the biggest problems with dehydration in the brain is it causes the brain cells to shrink. Less water inside the cell. And as that happens, then you get the whole brain, the mass of brain tissue also shrinking. No surprise. Here's a drawing of a very nicely hydrated brain. You can see this line here, which would represent the skull. You can see the blue line there, which can represent the 3 coverings of the brain, the meninges. And then you see the actual tissue, and they're just right tight on top of each other. Now, we have some brain cell shrinkage, which shrinks the tissue itself. And now look what's happening. Can you see this space? And the tissue is pulling away from the skull. Not a good idea. Shrinkage of brain tissue is a known factor that is now linked with dementia. If your goal is not dementia, then you need to get serious about hydration. I mentioned this again. Majority of persons over the age of 55 are dehydrated. Dehydrated means what? Not enough water, absolutely. If you can state it, you know it. If you can't, maybe you don't. Now, some are suggesting, this is brand new research, that proper hydration may help reduce the risk of at least these 3 types of diseases. Dementia, and Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. Parkinson's disease, and Lou Gehrig's disease. Wouldn't it be amazing if they really can get the studies to show that people who stay hydrated, or even if these are beginning, if they get serious about hydration, they maybe at least slow the progression. That would be phenomenal. Don't need a doctor's prescription, don't need to buy anything, just drink water. We come now to the energy that is required by the brain in order to do anything. Cognitive thinking, planning, making choices, directing other parts of the body. Water gives the brain electrical energy for all brain functions. And I'm sure you realize that the neuronal software that we have in our brains, that we often call habits, but that also activate other organs, they use electricity to move along the neuron pathways, the pieces of software. No electricity, they're not going anywhere. You use chemical energy to move information from the end of one neuron to the axon of another neuron, because if you remember from high school biology, there's a space between the neurons called the, anybody remember? Synapse. Funny little name. My quarterly brain bulletin is called Synapses. We're thinking about the information. So it needs electricity to move that information across these pathways. And if properly hydrated in parts of the brain, those messages travel at the rate of 600 miles per hour. 600 miles per hour. Now that's faster than most of the planes that I've been taking recently back and forth to Australia. It's 500 and some miles per hour. So 600 miles per hour is significant. The movement of water in and out of the cell, you know, the membrane around a cell is permeable. Fluid goes in carrying micronutrition, fluid goes out carrying wastes, and so on and so forth. As that fluid moves in and out of the cells, it functions much like a hydroelectric plant. You can think of water going over the dam and creating electricity. Well, water in and out of the cell does a similar thing. There's more water inside the cells than outside. That's if everything's going well. The cells are nice and plump. Dehydration reverses that ratio. And now the cells themselves start to shrink because there's less water in there. And when water levels fall within the cells, the production of energy also falls. So as people get dehydrated, they get sluggish. They're tired. They don't feel like doing anything. This disruption of the balance of more water inside the cell and less water outside the cell causes problems. Problems with short-term memory. And it can be as simple as hopping in the car and heading for the store and going, now what was I going to get at the store? Or you write down a list and you're in the car and you go, where did I put that list? You know, you just can't remember short-term. Recall of long-term memory is definitely impacted. So when you see individuals with any form of dementia, certainly Parkinson's disease, Lou Gehrig sometimes, they have a terrible time remembering even the past, never mind the short-term memory problems. Definitely it impacts conscious cognitive activities. Examples are mental arithmetic. You want to figure out how much something costs and there's a 10% discount, and if you don't have your iPhone with you, you go, I don't know, what's 10% of $100? Duh. You could ordinarily do that, but you're dehydrated and everything is fuzzy, or you're trying to do the tip. You know, 7% of $30, what is that? I should know that. Well, let me get a pencil and paper out. Now, how do I divide? I mean, literally, not doing it well. Things like the alarm goes off in the morning, which unfortunately probably means that you're not getting enough sleep. Because if you're getting enough sleep, ordinarily you are able to wake up at the time you want to wake up without an alarm clock. But you're not getting enough sleep, which is independently linked with longevity. Alarm clock goes off and you say to yourself, oh man, wonder if I can just hit the snooze button and sleep 15 more minutes. If I do that, will I be late to my appointment or can I get there in time? Well, if you're dehydrated, you're not going to be able to figure that out. Something that simple. You'll hit the snooze button and you'll keep hitting the snooze button, and about noon, you'll show up at work and your boss is not going to be amused. Because other body fluids are so critical to brain function, we also have to look at what happens to the blood and to the immune fluid. Those specifically, those two types of, and urine for that matter as well, I'm sure that all of you have had urine that was really, really concentrated. A very, very dark amber orange color. Sometimes it even smells different. So the blood and the immune fluid, because everything's dehydrated, is starting to get thicker. And what does that mean for the brain? Well, it means that as it gets thicker, the blood, it slows down and it can reduce oxygen to the brain. Have to have oxygen. It uses 20% of all the oxygen that you take in through your lungs. And it's, what, 3% of your body weight, something like that? It reduces other nutrients that come to the brain. Micronutrition, minerals, vitamins, enzymes. It can reduce the glucose that you need from macronutrition. And on the reverse side, it slows the removal of toxins and waste. So you know what you feel like after you've eaten a really big meal and eaten another one too soon and you feel kind of bloated. Well, basically, your brain gets kind of bloated, it gets sluggish. You get tired. You might even go to the doctor and say, I'm feeling really run down. And if you aren't able to tell him consciously how much water you're drinking and whatever else is happening, they may miss the fact that you're dehydrated unless they do some tests on you. I was visiting friends last week. I was down in Southern California and doing some seminars, and there were some friends of mine that I knew, so I stopped in to see them. The man's father had just died. He was 92. When they brought him to the hospital because he was sluggish and no energy and not thinking well, he was 40% dehydrated. They started pumping fluids into him, but it was too late. They could not reverse that, and he died. And I'm going, how in the world do you get 40% dehydrated? So that was unfortunate, because otherwise he had been doing really well. He was very healthy, and I think he could have lived to be 100. But you have to help anybody over 55 realize that you have to drink based on a formula, not based on your thirst. Not only does the blood thicken, but now, and because of that, less oxygen, less nutrients, and so on, but the risk of blood clots increase because it's not flowing so easily through the arteries and the veins. If a blood clot occurs in the brain, you will likely get what? A stroke. Not pretty. The lymph fluid. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I'm sure you're familiar with the immune system, and it has lymph fluid. When the lymph fluid thickens, it interferes with the brain's immune system, which we now know exists. Those three coverings of the brain are filled with immune system vessels. And when the immune system can't work properly, because theory is this. You know, they've talked about Alzheimer's disease for years with the tangles and the tau protein clumps and so on. And they said this probably causes Alzheimer's. I think everybody's going to rethink that. Probably what happens, according to some of the latest research I've seen, is that the lymph system is not working up to top speed. It is not removing the toxins and waste products, the results of which end up being tangles in these tau proteins and so on and so forth. And so Alzheimer's may be the result of failure of the immune system, which is really makes a lot of sense to me. And therefore, even more important than the blood is keeping that lymph fluid going. Here's the drawing of the brain pulled apart, so you can see the skull there. Now you can see three layers. They're called the meninges, and they cover your brain to keep all of that tissue in place, if you will, because brain tissue can leak. I mean, it's slow. It's like a thick pudding, but it'll leak. And then here's the brain tissue. And it's only since 2015, the end of 2015, that we have known that all of these lymph vessels are in these three layers. I don't know how that happened. This is the 21st century. How did we miss that? But we did. So now we know the brain has its own lymph system, and it's really critical for both brain tissue and for the lymph system to keep it well hydrated. Those three layers are the dura mater, if you want to know what their names are, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. I don't know where they get those names, but anyway. I'm sure we've talked about in the past that depending on your size, now I never grew much over 5 feet, so I probably have in the neighborhood of 60,000 miles of blood vessels, and that itself is staggering, because that's what, 2.5 times around the equator, almost. Some of you guys have a lot more than that. But we're talking 250,000 miles of lymph vessels that need to stay hydrated because they're so critical. When you fly on an airplane, especially on a long trip, and you're in the middle seat, so you don't get up and move around too much, when you get off the plane, what do you sometimes notice?
Stiff.
You're stiff, you definitely are.
Swollen ankle.
Swollen ankles, absolutely. Where'd the swollen ankles come from?
Inflammation and dehydration.
That's part of it. People don't drink enough on the plane. But in addition, the lymph vessels have no muscles in their walls. The lymph is moved along by the action of the large body muscles. That's why it's so important to get up and walk up and down the aisle. So if you've just been sitting there and there's not a lot of muscle movement, nothing to move the fluid. And so you look down and you have these very large ankles that sometimes can take time to, a couple days to change. So here's the work by Jonathan Kipnis. It was a graduate doctoral student who actually in his lab was the person who first identified what are these things? I've never seen these before. I don't know what they are. And they turned out to be the lymph vessels in the brain. So Jonathan Kipnis says lymph dehydration may be a big problem. And they're working on, especially in Alzheimer's, thinking that the accumulation of those big protein chunks and the tangles and so on are accumulating because the immune system vessels and the lymph aren't getting rid of them. They're toxins, they're wastes. Fascinating, he recently released a report that says they believe there are implications for other neurological diseases based on dehydration of the lymph system. And the two that they're looking at now are autism spectrum disorders and schizophrenia. One of the things that we think we know in the United States is that ingestion of water, drinking of water, has fallen in exchange for the drinking of what? Sodas and soft drinks and sports drinks and fruit juices. And oh my goodness. So we don't know if autism spectrum disorders are actually increasing just because more people are getting them, separate from dehydration, or the fact that for at least this whole generation, people are drinking things that are really not hydrating the brain and the lymph system. And that would be really unfortunate. There was a study done in Europe of 3 to 5-year-olds. And some of those 3 to 5-year-olds were drinking no water a day, none at all. They were just drinking pop, stuff like that, sugary drinks.
Can we ask you really quick, why is it that doctors now, to a newborn baby, if you give in a bottle, they don't want you giving them water? They said, when you mix the milk, the powdered milk, there's the water. My mother told me just give it to the kids.
When you, and that's true, and I do not know why some medical professionals are not up to speed. But here's the bottom line. When a baby cries because it's thirsty, it can't tell you that I'm thirsty. And the typical mother shoves a bottle of formula into that baby's mouth. And what that child learns is that food is the response to this feeling. And they don't even learn the difference between hunger and thirst. So they're thirsty and they eat. So no wonder that we're putting weight on all over the country. Because if you're not drinking water, if you're thirsty, but you're eating instead, it's just going to put weight on you. So you have to teach these individuals how to recognize thirst. And one of the ways that I do that is I'll tell people, if you get the urge to eat, drink a big glass of water first. Wait 30 minutes. Ask yourself, am I really, really hungry? Or was I thirsty? Or am I just in the habit of snacking? And people who will do that often quickly begin to discriminate against, no, I wasn't hungry, because I'm not hungry now, but I was thirsty. And as we get older, I mentioned, you lose the easy discrimination. Now let's see what happens to the brain in relation to the gastrointestinal system. When you are dehydrated, the ability of this gastrointestinal system, which starts at the mouth and ends a little further south, it's reduced. Its ability to digest nutrients is reduced because there's not enough water, not enough fluid. And it impacts the brain because that in itself can reduce the nutrients that reach the brain. And because the digestive system is ineffective, it's not being able to digest and absorb these nutrients, it triggers brain fatigue and what is being called cognitive fog. Just not too sharp. What's my name again? I'll think of it in a minute. I mean, literally, everything slows down. And that fog comes most likely from a reduced production of important neurotransmitters. You cannot move information from one neuron to another across the neuron highways if you don't have the neurotransmitters, because it's electrical and then chemical. And it's the neurotransmitters that get the information across the synapse, to say nothing of lower levels of micronutrients and macronutrients. Most of the chemical processes that occur in the brain and body occur inside the cell. And as the water content ratio begins to decrease, and there's less water inside the cell, it can trigger incomplete or inaccurate chemical processes. And that's critical for neurotransmitters, because that's the only way we think. It's critical for hormones. I mean, insulin. You don't have enough insulin, you're in a world of hurt. Certain enzymes and the ability to have cells reproduce themselves appropriately. Just remember, there's supposed to be more water inside the cell than outside. And by the time you're getting wrinkles on your face, your cells are already dehydrated. That's really partly what wrinkling is as people get older. Individuals who stay well hydrated in anecdotal studies have far fewer wrinkles than people who aren't. How does dehydration impact these neurotransmitters? This is a drawing of a neuron. There's the cell body. Think of your palm of your hand as a cell body. This is the axon, that one largest projection. And somebody as tall as some of you gentlemen have some very long ones here. How tall are you, Greg?
6.
Okay, so he's got neurons that start in the brain with axons almost 6 feet long. I don't have any longer than 5 feet. I feel so deprived. but that it's critical to keep them stretched out. These are the dendrites, like the fingers on your hand, and these are the parts of the neuron that pull information into the cell. So you see they're not touching each other. There's a space. The end of the axon and then the dendrites. And so electricity carries it this far, and then chemicals, neurotransmitters, swim it across the synapse. Water is absolutely required to create the neurotransmitters. Think of them as little skin divers. I don't care what metaphor you use. And these neurotransmitters are critical to cognitive thinking because they're what help move the information across the pathway. So nerve transmission, one neuron to another across these pathways, uses 1/2 of all the brain's energy. So if you are losing energy because you don't have the proper balance between fluid inside the cell and outside the cell, you're going to impact transmission. You're going to think much more slowly, for example, if you can pull up the information at all, because that's such an energy intensive type of process in the brain. Not only that, brain cells need at least twice as much energy as cells anyplace else in your body, even in your heart. And water provides this energy more effectively than any other substance. That's pretty impressive, actually. Corinne Allen is founder of the Advanced Learning and Development Institute. She's doing some pretty interesting research. This is one of them. Water provides energy more effectively than any other substance. Sodas aren't going to cut it. Sweet sugary drinks aren't going to cut it. Coffee isn't going to cut it. Fruit juices aren't going to cut it. It needs water. This movement of the water through the cell membrane functions like a hydroelectric plant, basically. As water moves in and out, hydroelectric power is generated and stored as ATP. I'm sure you've heard of ATP. It's the energy molecule, if you will. As soon as water levels start to fall, your production of energy starts to fall. Dr. Allen said that individuals with brain challenges such as ADD, head injuries, anxiety attacks, depression, and the autism spectrum often drink little, if any, water a day. They've been doing research with these groups of people. Some aren't drinking any water, some are drinking very little. The resulting dehydration promotes and exacerbates brain dysfunction. So now we've got brains that are working really well, and they get dehydrated, so they're working even less effectively. Now this is something that she just released fairly recently that I think is extremely interesting. Dr. Allen believes that alkaline water may be beneficial for many of these brain challenges. So her push is to try to get people with these types of diagnosis to drink water, and if possible, make that water alkaline. It's sometimes hard to know exactly the reason for these differences, but in her studies, when she gave individuals alkaline water at an appropriate level, many of their symptoms got much milder. 1% level of dehydration, that is not very much, is going to result in a 5% decrease in your ability to think clearly. What is it going to impact? With a 1% level of dehydration, you are going to see, in most cases, forgetfulness, inability to focus. So these little kids come to school and they haven't had enough water to drink and they can't focus. And at recess, they drink another soda. General difficulty getting things done, well, you don't have the energy. I mean, it's more, you just want to sit there and watch TV. Negative impact on productivity and the amount of work you get done. An increase in making mistakes. Now, mistakes are just proof that you're a human being, but we do like to have as few as possible. So dehydration increases the number of mistakes you make, and you become accident prone. And that's especially lethal when you're driving. And this is partly the impetus behind, they're trying to pass a law in some states where anyone under the age of 5 can't even have a cell phone in the car turned on because of this. The brain's not fully engaged when you're thinking about who might be calling you. We talked about this in part 1, but since some of you weren't here then, I'm going to repeat this. How much water do you need? Forget the number of glasses per day. Not helpful. You want to take in enough water every single day to have 1 or 2 pale urines per day. I was speaking down south a couple weeks ago, and actually we were talking about this, and somebody in the audience said, well, how do you know if you've had a pale urine? I said, you're gonna have to look. If you've ever been around little kids, they get so excited when they do something that they can see. And they're always happy. Come and see what I did. Yeah, I had 3 little boys, got real tired of that. Nevertheless, look, pay attention. Because depending on how much you're doing, depending on the heat, depending on the humidity, you can quickly see if you're dehydrated. And boy, I watch that, especially since I'm spending about 1/4 of my time down in Bakersfield now working with an education company, and it's very hot down there. And sometimes you don't realize how hot it is. And then you go to the bathroom and you go, oops. And I'm heading for my bottle of alkaline water. I first heard this from a professor at Stanford. And he just gave me the classic, thing that I remember all the time. He said, if your brain needs fluid and you're not giving it to it, at any given time, the largest amount of fluid in your body is where? In the bladder. So the brain will send a message down and say, we're a little short of fluid up here. Why don't you dehydrate some of that urine and send me some fluid, please? Thank you very much. And he says that turns you into a pea brain. Which is a rather unattractive idea, as far as I'm concerned. Occasionally, there are people who have a medical condition or who are taking specific types of medication that have to limit their water intake, which is unfortunate and very sad. But for the rest of us, that's the rule. Read with me. Take in enough water to have 1 or 2 pale urines per day. Got it? Yes. And occasionally you'll be taking medication that turns your urine a pretty dark color. But there's still variations with that. My particular source of water is Ion Thrive. Because not only is it purifying the water, but it's alkalinizing the water. And now with the research from Dr. Allen, that may be preventive for some of these conditions. Oh, I'm doing everything I can. Because how long am I aiming to live? 122 years.
And 165
165 days. Well, you mustn't be dehydrated. That was very good. Okay, I really encourage you to pay attention to this. This is my number one thing that I pay attention to in terms of my brain function. We'll see you next time.
That was excellent.